Hello, everyone in Prusy. Okay, let's unpack this. If you stand before one of the great pyramids today, first question that often leaps into your mind, maybe a little shamefully, is just how?
It's almost an involuntary reaction, isn't it?
It is. And it's followed immediately by this fantastical idea that it must have been impossible for ancient people, which leads you straight down the rabbit hole to aliens or some lost super technology.
And that core human fascination, that need to explain things that feel impossible, is really what connects all our sources today. It's this gap between the myth and the much more complicated reality.
Absolutely. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We've got a massive stack of sources today that span, 4 millennia and 3 different continents.
Yeah, it's a huge spread.
Yeah.
But the theme is always the same. Popular myth versus historical facts.
So first, we are going to tear down that huge Hollywood lie about pyramid construction. It wasn't built by tormented slaves getting whipped under the sun. The truth is much more interesting. It involves paid labor and a lot of beer.
A lot of beer. Then we're diving into the world of medieval highwaymen, who were, far more strategic than just simple thieves. They were running sophisticated surveillance networks.
And using the landscape itself as their main weapon.
Exactly. And then we're going to follow Marco Polo down the Silk Road to look at the profound cultural shock he must have felt, especially around things like hospitality and marriage.
Things that would have just been unthinkable in 13th century Venice. And finally, we'll track the spectacular political self-destruction of Mark Antony. So our goal is to really dissect the precision, the logistics, and the cultural context that made all of this possible.
And this raises a big question right from the start, doesn't it? Why does the myth, the alien story, persist long after we know the facts? The truth that ancient people were masters of geometry and logistics is, frankly, way more impressive.
It's so much more impressive. All right, let's start at Giza. Let's tackle that persistent piece of cinematic fiction, the great slavery myth.
Right.
Everyone pictures it, right? Thousands of half-naked people, exhausted, being driven to death by cruel overseers. Why is that image so powerful?
Well, your source puts it perfectly. Filmmakers love dramatic scenery. It's a simple, high-stakes story, good versus evil. But it's just not historically accurate.
So what's the truth that archaeology has uncovered?
Modern work, especially from people like Dr. Mark Lehner and Dr. Zahi Hawass, has really confirmed what we suspected. The pyramids were built by a massive, highly organized, and paid Egyptian workforce.
Paid? Okay, what does paid even mean in the Old Kingdom? We're not talking about direct deposit in a 401k here.
No, not quite.
Yeah.
But they received wages in the form of food rations, and really good ones at that. They got housing, surprisingly advanced medical care, and even time off. This wasn't a punishment. This was a national infrastructure project.
A source of national
A
pride.
huge source of pride. The pay, as I said, was mostly in rations. Daily bread, onions, garlic, things that provided essential nutrients, and of course beer. But the workforce wasn't just, a random mob. It was a tiered system.
So specialists.
Highly specialized. You had a small core of permanent elite architects and stonemasons at the top. And they were supported by vast numbers of skilled laborers who would rotate in and out.
And a lot of these laborers came from farming families, right? During the Nile flood.
Yes, that's such a key detail. It was a form of national service, but also seasonal employment. When the fields were underwater, this work provided stability and income. It was an incredibly smart system.
And the organization itself, the teams they were in, that points to pride, not servitude.
Absolutely. They were organized into divisions and then into smaller groups or gangs. And the names of these gangs are just fantastic.
Oh, this is the best part.
They had names like the Friends of Khufu, or my personal favorite, the Drunkards of Menkar.
I love that. It just paints such a different picture. These are the guys moving multi-ton stones, and they're calling themselves the Drunkards of Menkar. It's so human.
It is. It shows camaraderie. But the really irrefutable evidence of their value comes from the burial sites.
Right. You don't build cemeteries for slaves.
You absolutely do not. Archaeologists found entire purpose-built worker villages near the pyramids. Barracks, massive communal bakeries that could make thousands of loaves of bread a day, kitchens, and dedicated medical facilities.
And the cemeteries themselves?
Workers who died on the project were buried with honors. They were put in mud brick tombs, given burial goods. We've even found skeletons with bones that were clearly broken and then set, healed professionally. They even performed primitive surgeries.
That's a critical historical marker.
Oh.
These were respected citizens, vital to the state.
Exactly. And their fuel to get all this work done. the famous beer rations.
And we should be clear, this wasn't like a light lager you'd get today.
Not at all. The daily ration was about 4 liters per person. And this beer was thick. It was more like a nutritious porridge, almost like liquid bread.
So it was a food source.
It was a huge source of calories and B vitamins. For men doing that kind of intense physical labor in the desert, it was the perfect energy drink. It kept morale high, provided calories, and it was safer to drink than river water.
So if the base of this whole operation was paid labor fueled by beer, the Brain Trust was this elite nerd squad of architects and engineers.
That's the perfect term for them. These weren't just priests guessing. They were masters of geometry, astronomy, and logistics.
And they're achieving this absurd level of precision with what we would consider very primitive tools.
Well, their simplicity, in a way, forced them to be more precise. They used things like plumb bobs, water levels, and measuring ropes. But these ropes weren't just, tangled string.
They were precision instruments.
Yes. They were made of palm fiber, soaked, dried, stretched tight, with knots tied at exact intervals. This gave them a reliable grid system for surveying huge areas.
But the most famous achievement, the one that always gets people talking about aliens, is the Great Pyramid's alignment to true north. It is absurdly accurate. How on earth did they do that in 2560 BCE?
It's all about astronomy. They tracked the movement of circumpolar stars that, circle the celestial pole but never dip below the horizon.
So they're always visible.
Right. They'd use 2 key stars that appeared to be on opposite sides of true north. By tracking the point where these stars reached their highest and lowest points, they could basically bisect that angle and find true north with just a pole and a piece of string. It's brilliant.
Just sheer intellectual confidence. And what about the engineering itself? I mean, they're not just stacking stones, they're solving really complex physics problems.
Oh, absolutely. They had an intuitive understanding of structural load distribution. They knew to build on solid bedrock, not shifting sand. They mastered the slope ratio, that famous 51-degree angle, which gives you the maximum height with the most stability.
Inside the pyramid, the king's chamber has to support millions of tons of stone above it. How did they stop it from just pancaking?
This might be their single greatest engineering achievement.
Yeah.
The invention of the relieving chambers.
Okay, break that down for us.
A flat roof, like the one on the king's chamber, would just crack and collapse under that much weight. So above it, they built 5 stacked, separated rooms. And each room is roofed with these massive granite beams.
So it's like a buffer zone.
It's a genius buffer zone. The uppermost room has a gabled or pointed roof. This entire structure takes the immense weight from above and deflects it. It diverts the force outward into the main body of the pyramid and down into the bedrock.
It's an ancient shock absorber.
It's a perfect ancient shock absorber system.
Yeah.
It shows this deep, applied knowledge of structural dynamics. The pyramids really are a monument to applied geometry, not just brute force.
That intellectual rigor is incredible, but at the end of the day, someone still had to cut and move 2.5 million stone blocks.
And that brings us to the harsh reality of the quarries. The first bit of good luck they had was that most of the limestone was sourced locally, right there on the Giza Plateau.
So that minimized transport. But quarrying it, that was another story. They're using copper chisels against hard limestone. That sounds incredibly frustrating.
It was a logistical nightmare. Copper is much softer than limestone, so the chisels would get dull almost instantly. The construction site had to have a constant team of blacksmiths working, like an overworked pit crew at a race, just constantly reheating, reshaping, and sharpening tools.
The whole project would grind to a halt without them.
Completely. And for the really hard stuff, for the inner chambers, they needed granite from Aswan, hundreds of miles away, and copper just won't touch granite.
So what did they use?
Brute dense force. They use what are called dolerite pounders. Dolerite is this incredibly hard, dark, igneous rock. And they would just use these heavy, angry rocks to relentlessly batter the granite, crushing it and grinding it down millimeter by millimeter until they could shape the blocks.
That's agonizingly slow work.
Tremendously difficult. And once the blocks were cut, the challenge became moving them. Now, we all hear the myth about rolling them on logs.
Right, which isn't true. Why not?
Logistically impossible. Egypt just didn't have the huge hardwood forests needed to produce millions of logs for that. Wood was precious. It was often imported. You wouldn't just grind it to splinters under a 2-ton stone block.
So they used sledges instead, huge wooden sleds.
Massive wooden sledges. But dragging those across dry sand would have been nearly impossible because of the friction. The sand piles up in front.
This is where the genius water trick comes in.
This is the ancient cheat code. They learned that if you pour a very specific amount of water on the sand right in front of the sledge, you dramatically reduce the friction.
What's the science there?
It's called capillary action. The water makes the sand grains clump together, transforming the loose sand into a firm, solid surface. The sledge just glides over it. We even have ancient wall paintings showing a worker pouring water from a jar right in front of the pulling team.
That's incredible. And for the huge granite blocks from Aswan, they just use the Nile.
The Nile was the ultimate highway. They'd load these blocks, some weighing up to 80 tons, onto specialized barges and float them downriver during the flood season. The logistics of coordinating that supply chain are arguably as impressive as the pyramid itself.
Okay, so the stones are at the site. Now you have to get them up. This brings us to the ramps. We know they were essential, but there's still a debate about what kind they used.
Right, and the debate exists because the ramps were temporary. They were built of mud brick and rubble and then dismantled, so they didn't leave much evidence. The sources suggest a few main possibilities, and they all have pretty big trade-offs.
Let's start with the simplest, the straight ramp.
The street ramp would extend out from one face of the pyramid. The problem is, to reach the top, it would have to be either brutally steep or stretch for over a mile. It also blocks the face of the pyramid, which the architects needed to see to check the angles.
So that probably led to the zigzag ramp.
Yeah, the zigzag ramp snakes back and forth across a single face. This reduces the steepness, but it turns the job into a long, grueling cardio workout. And then there's the most dramatic theory, the spiral ramp.
Which wraps around the whole pyramid.
Like a giant sandstone unicorn horn, yeah. But that creates huge visibility problems for the masons trying to align the casing stones, and you'd have haulers bumping into each other on tight corners. It's very likely they used a combination of these methods.
Regardless of the ramp, that precision is just staggering. The base of the Great Pyramid is flat to within less than an inch across an area the size of several football fields. How?
They most likely used water. They probably dug a series of shallow trenches around the perimeter, filled them with water, and used that as a massive, perfect level. By marking where the water hit the stone, they could ensure the entire foundation was perfectly horizontal. Any error there would be amplified catastrophically as they built upwards.
And finally, placing those massive granite blocks inside, the ones the size of a small whale, fitting them together so tightly you can't slip a knife between them.
Once they were up the ramps, it was all about levers, teamwork, and smaller angled ramps for the final placement. They would slowly nudge and pivot these multi-ton blocks into place. And that perfect joinery wasn't just for looks, it was structural. It resisted seismic shifts and kept out sand and water, ensuring the pyramid's eternal life.
It's a perfect fusion of Bronze Age sweat and science.
Exactly. Coordinated harmony on an unbelievable scale.
All right, let's jump forward nearly 3,000 years. We're moving from the unified logistical power of ancient Egypt to the fragmented, lawless world of medieval Europe.
It's a perfect narrative bridge, actually. If the pyramid is a monument to what centralized organization can achieve, the medieval road system is a testament to the chaos that happens when that authority collapses.
The open road becomes a hunting ground.
And the highwaymen were the wolves of the road. That nickname is so fitting because they were patient, strategic, and utterly ruthless.
And the central problem was that authority was just spread too thin. Sheriffs only controlled small areas, royal armies were tiny, and the roads were just muddy tracks that disappeared into thick forests.
And those forests could swallow entire gangs. What made the most feared groups so effective was their organization. This wasn't chaotic mugging. They worked in coordinated packs. They used coded signals whistles that sounded like bird calls, specific drum beats on logs to communicate.
It speaks to a level of planning. They weren't just waiting around hoping for a rich traveler to wander by.
No, they were gathering intelligence. They had informants everywhere, servants in noble houses, tavern keepers at major crossroads, even other merchants who trade information for a cut of the loot. They knew who was traveling, what they were carrying, and where they were going before the victim even saddled their horse.
So the attack itself was the final step of a long process.
A very fast, decisive final step. They'd use obstacles, like a felled tree or a rope strung across the road, to immobilize the target instantly, often before a single sword was even drawn.
And the landscape itself was their greatest accomplice. They were masters of terrain warfare.
Complete masters. They knew the dense forests and mountain passes better than any soldier. Forests weren't just for hiding. They were for strategic observation. Bandits would perch in trees like sentinels, watching the dust clouds from approaching caravans, judging their size and speed.
Travelers at the time wrote about that feeling, right? That unsettling sense of being watched.
Constantly. And that fear was a weapon in itself. Mountain passes were even worse. They were natural choke points.
Giving the bandits the ultimate high ground.
Exactly. They could trigger small, targeted rock slides to trap a caravan between cliffs. From that position, a small group with bows or even just heavy stones could control the entire situation without ever engaging in close combat.
Even the old Roman roads became part of the problem.
Yes, the symbols of imperial order had decayed into these crumbling corridors. You're overgrown, forcing travelers into predictable, slow-moving paths, perfect for an ambush. But the most insidious part was the psychological warfare.
What's so?
They would use things like an unnatural quiet in the forest to build tension. Or they'd leave strange markers, a broken wagon axle, a purse with a few copper coins left on a stump as bait to make travelers hesitate. That moment of hesitation was all they needed.
You mentioned they were organized brotherhoods. What kind of men formed these gangs?
They came from the desperate fringes of society. Runaway serfs, fleeing crushing taxes, failed mercenaries left over from a war, deserters from armies. They were bound together by greed and a raw instinct for survival. The captain usually ruled through fear and cunning, not democracy.
And their robberies were structured. You had different roles within the gang.
It was like a planned military operation. You had your scouts and informants gathering intelligence. You had your ambush engineers who were responsible for setting the trap, the fallen tree, the tripwire, and then you had the enforcers who carried out the actual assault.
What was their go-to tactic?
The most common and effective was the roadblock and pincer. An obstacle stops the caravan, and then attackers emerge from both sides of the road at once. The pincer. The guards are immediately surrounded.
And they used fear before they used force.
Always. They'd carve crude symbols, wolf heads, skulls into trees to mark their territory. Seeing those was a signal to travelers that they were already in the bandits' world, playing by their rules.
And then there's the chilling tactic of false help.
It's pure, brutal cynicism. A bandit would pretend to be injured on the road, knowing a kind-hearted pilgrim or merchant would feel obligated to stop and help. The moment the victim let their guard down, the whistle would blow and the gang would emerge. It made compassion itself a deadly risk.
And they even used the survivors as a tool.
Yes, they'd intentionally let a few go. Terrified, traumatized, but alive. Those survivors would rush to the next town and spread these wild, exaggerated stories about the attack. That psychological projection did half their work for them. It ensured future victims were already terrified and ready to surrender.
So who were the main targets?
Pilgrims were the easiest. They followed predictable holy routes and often carried money for donations. Easy pickings. Merchants, of course, were the rolling vaults, high value, but often guarded.
And nobles.
High risk, high reward. You targeted them for ransom, or sometimes just for the humiliation of stripping a lord of his finery and making him walk home barefoot.
But the cruelest robberies were often against the poor.
Absolutely. A bandit would take a peasant's only sturdy pair of boots, or their winter cloak, or the loaf of bread meant to last a week. It wasn't just a loss of property, it was potentially a death sentence.
And the authorities were just completely overwhelmed by all this.
It was a patchwork system. Local sheriffs didn't have the jurisdiction or the manpower. Town militias were no match for hardened outlaws. The only real threat to the bandits were mercenary hunters.
The professionals.
Hardened veterans hired by nobles to hunt gangs for coin. They were ruthless. They'd often return to town with severed heads on their saddles to collect the bounty. It was a grim business.
And when a bandit was caught, the justice was theatrical.
It was all about sending a message. Hangings at major crossroads were common, with the bodies left to rot for weeks as a warning. And then there was the gibbet.
The iron cage.
The ultimate gruesome warning. An iron cage built for the body, where the criminal was suspended, sometimes already dead, sometimes left to die of exposure. They'd leave them up for years, a horrifying landmark. But the irony is, all this brutality sometimes just turned the criminal into a legend.
Which leads us to the folk hero myth. Why did a society living in fear of these men also turn them into heroes?
Because the common people felt powerless. They resented the high taxes, the cruel lords. So they loved stories about anti-heroes who robbed the rich and supposedly helped the poor. It was a form of wish fulfillment.
Robin Hood is the most famous example, but this happened all over Europe.
All over. In Germany, you had the Schwarze Hans. In France, ballads about Lulu. The legends would strip away all the real brutality, the murder, the robbing of the poor, and replace it with this idealized righteousness, which, tragically, just inspired a new generation of desperate men to take to the roads.
So banditry was really a symptom of a broken society.
Exactly. It was a response to poverty, war, and isolation. It offered high pay and a sense of belonging. The wolves of the road never truly disappeared because the conditions that created them never truly went away.
Let's shift gears completely. We're leaving the fearful roads of Europe for the great commercial highway of the Silk Road through the eyes of Marco Polo.
And his journey, which started as a business trip, really became this deep cultural investigation. His book is less about trade and more about anthropology. It's an incredible window into non-Western social structures.
Especially around hospitality, marriage, and the role of women. Things that must have been profoundly shocking to a 13th century Venetian.
Deeply shocking. Let's start in Persia. For him, hospitality there was on a completely different plane. It wasn't just politeness, it was a sacred ritual. A guest was seen as carrying divine favor.
So the host was honor-bound to provide everything.
Everything: food, shelter, protection. To fail in hospitality was to bring deep shame on your entire household.
But it went far beyond just food and a place to sleep. He describes this custom that must have just been staggering for him, the host offering a companion for the night.
This is the most famous and culturally challenging custom he records. A host might offer a daughter, a servant, or friend as a temporary companion. And crucially, refusing this offer could be seen as a grave insult.
His writing on this is very diplomatic.
He had to be. He was writing for a deeply conservative Christian audience back in Venice.
Yeah.
So he never explicitly says what he did or didn't do. He uses these careful phrases like receiving great kindnesses or hosts who did all that was fitting.
It's a diplomatic code.
Exactly. It acknowledges the intimacy without getting him in trouble. It shows his own cultural flexibility, which was essential for a diplomat and a merchant. And this flexibility extended to marriage itself.
He saw a huge paradox there.
A huge one. On one hand, you had arranged marriages for clan loyalty, which he would have understood. But he also saw the practice of temporary marriages.
Legal, respected unions that only lasted for a set period of time.
Days, weeks, months. It was a practical solution for a merchant staying in a town for a trade fair, for instance. But the idea that a marriage commitment could be time-bound was utterly foreign to the European Catholic ideal.
And concubinage was also common.
Very common among the wealthy, for status and alliances. But again, contrary to European assumptions, these women often held significant indirect influence. They were skilled in music, poetry, negotiation. They were counselors, not just servants.
As he traveled, the caravanserai, those fortress-like inns, became the social hubs of the Silk Road.
They were the laboratories of the road. Everyone was forced to interact there. There were these massive walled compounds built to withstand raids. Inside, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, they all formed these temporary brotherhoods out of necessity.
Because traveling alone was a death sentence.
Absolutely. So alliances were forged for mutual protection. And intimacy played a practical role here too. In a place where loneliness meant vulnerability, companionship was both an emotional refuge and a practical alliance. It strengthened the bonds you needed to survive the next leg of the journey.
And business and personal relationships just merged completely.
They did. A merchant might offer his daughter in marriage to a colleague to seal a business partnership. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway for goods. It was a highway for strategic bonds and familial alliances that flowed just as richly as the spices.
Then he moves into Central Asia, the steppe, the lands of the Turks and Mongols. And this is where the gender roles must have seemed completely alien.
This was the most radical departure from what he knew. In Venice, women were confined to the home. On the steppe, their labor was essential for survival, so they had remarkable freedom.
They were visible, they were active.
They rode horses, they hunted, they managed the herds, they negotiated in the markets, roles that were completely unthinkable for a noble Venetian woman.
So marriage was all about pragmatism.
Totally. A bride was valued for her labor, her skills, her connections, not just her beauty. Polygamy was common for chiefs, but the wives weren't passive. They wielded real, independent authority.
They managed their own camps, their own resources.
Exactly. They were confident, outspoken partners in survival, not subordinates. Marco was clearly stunned by their autonomy.
And when he finally gets to the Mongol court of Kublai Khan, everything gets scaled up again. Here, relationships are actual instruments of governance.
There was statecraft through personal relationships. The Mongol Empire was so vast and diverse, they used marriage and intimate alliances as a key tool to maintain unity and control.
How are the women chosen for the court?
They were chosen as tribute from across the empire, and they were evaluated not just for beauty, but for their refinement, their skills in music, poetry, etiquette. They were symbols of imperial prestige.
And life in the palace was one of regimented luxury.
But underneath the perfumed baths and silk garments was this relentless, silent competition for the Khan's favor. A favored woman, whether a wife or a concubine, could gain immense power lands, titles, real influence.
So their political influence was tangible.
Completely. They acted as intermediaries, they advised the Khan, they advocated for their relatives. This kind of visible political power in the hands of women would have been scandalous in the West. But in the Mongol world, it was an essential part of the political machine.
Then his final stop, Cathay, or China, offers yet another contrast. If the Mongols were about raw power, China was about subtlety.
Yes, Marco saw relationships there as choreographed, measured, and sensual in their restraint. Marriage was all about creating harmony. Unions were arranged by professional matchmakers and astrologers to ensure the balance of yin and yang.
And the ideal woman was a cultural asset.
Precisely. Elite women were highly educated in poetry and calligraphy. Their influence was indirect but powerful, elevating the household's prestige through their ability to host and counsel. A very different ideal from the fierce horsewoman of the steppe.
And the courtesans in China differed from the Mongol concubines.
A huge difference. Mongol concubines had political weight. Chinese courtesans were cultural symbols of urban sophistication. They were trained in refined conversation and poetry. Intimacy was as much intellectual as it was physical.
And hospitality was an art form.
An absolute art form. Pleasure wasn't rushed. It was blended with elegance, incense, warm tea, soft music. It was about creating an atmosphere of deep, polished ease. For Marco, it represented the ultimate level of cultural sophistication.
Okay, for our final segment, we take a dramatic leap back west to the very end of the Roman Republic and a man whose fate was sealed by propaganda, Mark Antony.
A man of spectacular extremes, born noble but ruined by his own recklessness, drinking, gambling, chasing women, until military service under Julius Caesar saved him.
He was the quintessential Roman warrior.
The Lion of Rome. Physically imposing, athletic, and his soldiers absolutely adored him because he was one of them. He fought with them, he drank with them, he demanded fierce loyalty, and he gave it right back.
And his destiny became completely tied to Caesar's.
He was Caesar's living hammer. Caesar was the cold, calculating strategist. Antony was the raw, passionate force. He was Caesar's voice in the Senate and his enforcer on the streets.
Which is why, on the Ides of March, the conspirators had to get him out of the way.
A tactical necessity. They knew they couldn't get to Caesar if Antony was there to defend him. So one of the conspirators, Trebonius, intercepted him at the door to the Senate, kept him busy with a fake conversation while the assassination happened inside.
Antony fled, but his comeback was centered on Caesar's funeral. That speech wasn't just grief, it was a political weapon.
A masterwork of manipulation. Brutus spoke first, arguing that Caesar was ambitious and had to die. The crowd sort of reluctantly accepts it. Then Antony gets up, and he pretends to agree with Brutus, repeating over and over, and Brutus is an honorable man.
Dripping with irony.
So much irony that it completely poisons the argument. Then he brings out the visual aid. He pulls back Caesar's cloak to reveal the 23 stab wounds, pointing to the men who did it, standing right there. He doesn't have to accuse them, the spectacle does it for him. The crowd starts to turn.
And the final blow is the will.
Reading the will was genius. He reveals Caesar left money to every citizen and gave his private gardens to the public. In that one moment, Caesar goes from a potential tyrant to a martyred father of the people. The funeral explodes into a riot. The conspirators are forced to flee Rome. With one speech, Antony starts the civil wars.
In the chaos that followed, he forms that cold-blooded pact with young Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Lepidus, the second triumvirate.
A pact of necessity, not trust. And their first act is the proscriptions, a massive, brutal purge of their enemies to seize their property and fund the war.
And Antony uses this to settle personal scores.
Oh, absolutely. His most famous victim was the orator Cicero, his bitterest critic. Antony has him killed and then has his head and hands displayed in the forum. A chilling message that the Republic was over.
After they defeat the conspirators, Antony takes the wealthy, cultured East, and this is where he meets Cleopatra.
And his destiny changes forever. He goes to Tarsus expecting a subservient client queen. A lingual force of nature.
And her entrance was pure spectacle.
She arrives on a barge with purple sails and silver oars, presenting herself as the goddess Venus. Antony, the rough soldier, is just completely captivated.
But her seduction was strategic, it wasn't just physical.
She made him feel like he could be more than just Caesar's heir, that together they could forge a new, grand Eastern Empire, superior to the dying Roman Republic. She matched his ambition and his love of spectacle. They formed the inimitable Livers, this society devoted to extravagant pleasure in Alexandria.
And all the while, Octavian back in Rome is using every rumor as propaganda.
Yes, Octavian transforms himself into Rome's sober savior, and Antony hands him the perfect political weapon. He divorces Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for the foreign queen.
This allows Octavian to completely villainize him.
And then Octavian claims to have seized Antony's will. He reads it to the Senate, and it supposedly says Antony wants to be buried in Alexandria and is leaving Roman lands to his children with Cleopatra. He successfully frames the coming conflict as Rome versus a decadent foreign enemy.
Which all leads to the final battle at Actium in 31 BCE.
Antony has a larger fleet, but they're big, slow ships. Octavian's commander, Agrippa, has smaller, faster, more maneuverable vessels. Agrippa outmaneuvers Antony and traps his fleet.
And then comes the critical moment. Cleopatra's squadron breaks formation and flees, and Antony follows her.
To his soldiers, it's the ultimate betrayal. To Antony, it's the crushing realization that the war is lost. He abandons his men and his command.
They retreat to Alexandria. Octavian closes in, and his agents spread a lie that Cleopatra has killed herself.
And Antony believes it. He chooses the Roman way out and stabs himself. But the wound isn't immediately fatal, and he finds out she's still alive, barricaded in her mausoleum.
And so you get that devastating final scene.
He's hoisted up through a window, dying in her arms. His last advice to her is pragmatic. Make your peace with Caesar. Days later, she kills herself with an asp to avoid being paraded in Octavian's triumph. And with that, Octavian becomes Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and the Republic is officially dead.
So here's where it gets really interesting, tying this all together. We started with four, seemingly unrelated puzzles: a construction project, a criminal enterprise, a merchant's journey, and the collapse of a Roman titan.
But if you connect them, you see this profound unifying truth. Whether you're building a pyramid, robbing a caravan, or running an empire, the key is always high-level organization, logistics, and deep understanding of human motivation and fear.
Exactly. The Egyptians used beer and respect. The bandits used terrain and terror. Marco Polo succeeded through diplomacy and acceptance.
And Mark Antony failed because he lost control of the logistics at Actium and, maybe more importantly, lost the propaganda war back in Rome. Octavian's myth about him became more powerful than the reality.
So what does this all mean for us today? I mean, it raises this question. Do we prefer the simple, fantastical explanation, aliens, magic, chaos, or the complicated human truth of geometry, logistics, and ruthless organization?
The historical reality requires us to admit that ancient and medieval people were just as sophisticated and often more disciplined than we are.
The Great Pyramid is still standing, but Mark Antony's reputation was destroyed by a speech and maybe a forged will. Marco Polo's travels were dismissed as fantasy because Venetians couldn't believe the level of cultural sophistication he witnessed.
Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over. Which powerful historical legacy today is being deliberately misinterpreted or simplified for political or cultural convenience? And what will the true, complicated human history, the one based on logistics, money, and organization, actually look like 4,000 years from now?